Do you remember those little things from childhood that seemed ordinary at the time, but now feel like treasures? From Jell-O molds that wobbled proudly on the dinner table, to the clang of an ice cream truck's bell rolling down the street. Life in 1960s. America was stitched together with simple moments we've almost forgotten. How did so many of those everyday rituals slip quietly into the past? Let's take a trip back and uncover 50 forgotten things that once defined growing up in the 60s. Jell-O mold centerpieces.
Hey everybody, I'm Lisa. Now, you might think of a Jell-O mold as kind of an old-fashioned dish that belongs back in the 1950s or 60s.
There was a time when no church supper, no baby shower, and certainly no respectable suburban dinner party of the 1960s was complete without a wobbly, glistening Jell-O mold taking center stage on the table. Picture it: a ring of lime gelatin studded with canned pineapple, maraschino cherries floating like jewels, sometimes even a dollop of mayonnaise, or a layer of cottage cheese if the cook was feeling bold. Back then, these gelatin creations weren't just dessert, they were decoration, edible sculptures meant to impress. The molds themselves came in endless shapes, from fluted bunt-style rings to copper fish that looked more at home on a wall than in a fridge. Housewives competed for the most dazzling combination, flipping through Good Housekeeping for inspiration, and kids watched with a mix of awe and suspicion as vegetables somehow found their way into dessert. For many families, the Jell-O mold was a badge of modernity. It showcased the marvel of instant mixes, refrigeration, and a pinch of domestic flair. Today, we chuckle at the odd pairings. Carrots and lemon Jell-O, really? But in a way, TikTok aesthetic food is the grandchild of those ambitious gelatin towers. The Jell-O mold was kitsch, community, and creativity, all in one shimmering wobble. Tuna casserole.
Today on the Stay-at-Home Chef, I'm showing you how to make tuna casserole.
If you grew up in the 1960s, there's a good chance that Tuesday night smelled unmistakably like canned tuna, cream of mushroom soup, and a crunchy crown of crushed potato chips or breadcrumbs. Tuna casserole wasn't just dinner, it was a ritual, a predictable presence on the weekly family calendar. Born out of necessity and frugality, it married pantry staples with convenience. A can of tuna, a can of Campbell's, some noodles, and whatever topping mom had on hand to give it a little flair. It was filling, cheap, and just exotic enough to feel like something new in a decade where casseroles ruled the American table. For kids, it was either comfort or punishment, depending on how much they liked fish. For parents, it was a lifesaver, stretching a couple of cans into a meal that could feed 6 without complaint. In many households, the leftovers carried into Wednesday's lunches, reheated until the noodles were soft and the sauce somehow richer. Today, the casserole feels quaint, even retro, in a world of takeout sushi and endless pasta variations. Yet there's something deeply grounding about a dish that asked so little and gave so much, a symbol of thrift, routine, and the quiet rhythm of family life. Spam and Miracle Whip delicacies. There's no way around it. Spam and Miracle Whip were a match made in mid-century kitchens, and the 1960s embraced the duo with gusto. Spam, that pink block of mystery meat born in the 1930s, had become a post-war pantry staple, cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly adaptable. Pair it with Miracle Whip, the tangy, sweeter cousin of mayonnaise that Kraft marketed as the modern homemaker's best friend, and suddenly you had delicacies that made appearances at church picnics, after-school snacks, and late-night sandwiches. Sliced Spam fried in a skillet and slathered with Miracle Whip between between 2 pieces of Wonder Bread was the kind of quick fix that sustained working families, and as odd as it sounds, many swore by it. Of course, there were variations. Spam cubes in a salad bound together by Miracle Whip, Spam baked with a sugary glaze, or open-faced Spam canapes meant to impress company on a budget. To modern eyes, it borders on comedy. Why dress luncheon meat with what's essentially dessert mayonnaise? But in the 1960s, it was convenience food at its proudest. The kind of thing kids wolfed down before running outside to ride bikes until dark. Like avocado toast today, Spam and Miracle Whip was less about luxury and more about identity. Thrifty, practical, and strangely unforgettable. Pressure cookers, pre-Instant Pot. Long before the Instant Pot became the darling of TikTok meal prep videos, the pressure cooker was a hulking, slightly intimidating contraption that hissed and rattled on stovetops across 1960s America. These heavy metal pots, with their locking lids and steam valves that whistled like angry tea kettles, were the workhorses of the kitchen. They could tenderize tough cuts of meat, cook beans in record time, and turn a pile of vegetables into soup before the kids had finished setting the table. For families on tight budgets, pressure cookers meant stretching every ingredient further. Cheap roasts became fork tender, dried beans replaced pricier canned versions, and nothing went to waste. Of course, they weren't without drama. Nearly everyone has a family story about a pressure cooker mishap, steam hissing ominously, lids flying off, or dinner literally painting the ceiling. Housewives swap tips in cookbooks and magazines about avoiding explosions, but they kept using them because the payoff was too good to ignore. Compared to today's sleek, button-loaded electric models, those stovetop versions seem downright medieval, but they carried the same promise: faster, easier meals for busy households. The pressure cooker of the 1960s may have lacked Wi-Fi, but it delivered something timeless: hot, hearty food when it mattered most. Pyrex refrigerator dishes. Before every kitchen was overrun with mismatched plastic tubs and elusive Tupperware lids, there were Pyrex refrigerator dishes, sturdy, glass, and endlessly practical. In the 1960s, these colorful little boxes, often in cheerful pastel shades or with charming floral patterns, lined refrigerator shelves like tidy soldiers. Leftovers from Sunday's roast or Tuesday's tuna casserole slipped neatly inside, sealed with a snug glass lid that actually matched the container. Imagine that. Durable enough to withstand the oven, stylish enough to bring straight to the table, and transparent so you could actually see what was inside, Pyrex dishes were the unsung heroes of mid-century frugality. For many homemakers, they symbolized a kind of quiet order and pride. Opening the fridge to rows of neatly stacked glass dishes wasn't just about storage. It was about care, about stretching meals further, about making something last. Kids might groan at seeing last night's meatloaf staring back through the glass, but those dishes kept food from going to waste in a time when leftovers weren't a shame but a strategy. Today, vintage Pyrex has a cult following, with collectors paying hundreds for the same floral patterns that once sat humbly beside the milk. Proof that beauty, even in leftovers, never really goes out of style. Homemade TV dinners with foil trays. Long before microwaves and lean cuisine, the 1960s kitchen had its own spin on convenience: the homemade TV dinner. Inspired by the store-bought versions that promised modern living in a compartmentalized tray, thrifty moms recreated the idea at home using simple foil pans. Leftover meatloaf, mashed potatoes, a scoop of peas, maybe even a brownie, all tucked neatly into sections, wrapped in foil, and stacked in the freezer like little promises of future miniature dinners. It wasn't just about saving money, though that mattered. It was also about keeping up with the era's fascination with efficiency and space-age living. Eating a hot meal in front of the television felt futuristic, even glamorous, when the glow of Bonanza or The Ed Sullivan Show lit up the living room. For kids, it was pure magic. Your own tray, your own food, no fighting over portions. For parents, it was relief on a hectic night, a way to keep dinner on schedule without starting from scratch. Compared to today's slick meal kits and frozen dinners boasting artisan flavors, these foil tray creations were humble but heartfelt. They represented a new rhythm of family life. Food, not just for sustenance, but for sharing the cultural ritual of primetime TV. Gelatin salads with marshmallows and fruit cocktail. Few dishes capture the glorious absurdity of 1960s dining quite like the so-called gelatin salad. Imagine a shimmering block of lime or orange jello, suspended within it canned fruit cocktail. Those neon red cherries, rubbery grapes, and bits of pear no one really wanted, along with a handful of mini marshmallows for good measure. Sometimes there was even a layer of Cool Whip or cottage cheese hiding inside, as though the concoction couldn't decide whether it wanted to be dessert, appetizer, or science experiment. And yet, on potluck tables and at family reunions, these gelatin towers gleamed with pride. They weren't just food, they were edible centerpieces, a chance for homemakers to show off creativity in an era when convenience foods and novelty reigned supreme. Kids loved them for the sugar and color, adults tolerated them for the trend, and everyone seemed to silently agree not to question the logic of marshmallows in a salad. Today, we look back with a mix of nostalgia and disbelief. Why did vegetables sometimes sneak into these too? But in their own wobbly way, gelatin salads embodied the spirit of the decade. Playful, experimental, and always ready to shine under the soft light of a church basement buffet. Coffee percolators, bubbling on the counter. Before Keurigs chirped and espresso machines hissed, the soundtrack of a 1960s morning was the steady burble of a coffee percolator, sitting proudly on the kitchen counter, chrome gleaming under the fluorescent light. It promised the household that caffeine was on its way. The ritual was almost theatrical. Water in the base, grounds in the little basket, and then the bubbling began. You could watch through the glass knob on top as the liquid turned darker with each cycle, a hypnotic preview of the bitter cup to come. That smell, rich, earthy, and slightly overbrewed, drifted into bedrooms, nudging parents awake before the alarm clock ever did. Of course, percolator coffee had its quirks. It was strong, sometimes too strong, with a hint of metallic bite, but no one complained. It fueled 9-to-5 dads, homemaker moms, and bleary-eyed teens heading off to school. A fresh pot often doubled as a social invitation too. Neighbors dropped by for a cup and a chat long before Starbucks made coffee culture a thing. Compared to today's pour-overs and oat milk lattes, the percolator seems quaint, but it carried something those gadgets often miss: the slow communal rhythm of brewing, where the wait was part of the comfort. Bread boxes on every counter. In the 1960s, the bread box was as essential to a kitchen as the stove or the coffee pot, a quiet little guardian of every family's daily loaf. Usually metal, sometimes wood, and often decorated with cheerful daisies or sleek mid-century lettering. It sat proudly on the counter, reminding you that Wonder Bread had a throne of its own. The logic was simple: keep bread fresh, keep mice out, and keep the kitchen tidy. And it worked, most of the time. Kids learned quickly that opening the bread box box meant more than grabbing a slice. It was a portal to peanut butter sandwiches, toast dripping with butter, or maybe even a late-night Spam and Miracle Whip creation. The bread box wasn't just storage, it was a symbol of abundance, of never running out of the thing that could stretch any meal. Toast for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, dinner rolls on the side, bread was always there, waiting under that little hinged lid. Today, plastic bags and preservatives have made bread boxes nearly obsolete, relics tucked away in thrift shops or turned into retro decor. But there's something comforting about the idea, a designated, almost ceremonial place for the most humble of foods, reminding us that even the simplest slice deserved its own home. Powdered milk for emergencies. In the 1960s, no well-prepared household was without a box of powdered milk tucked in the pantry, waiting patiently for its moment of duty. It wasn't glamorous. Few things are when they begin as a chalky scoop of powder whisked into cold water. But it was practical. For families on a budget or those with a sudden milk shortage before payday or delivery day, powdered milk was the quiet hero. It stretched grocery dollars, filled cereal bowls, and blended into recipes where no one could quite tell the difference. At least that was the hope. Children, however, often could tell, wrinkling noses at its thinner taste and faintly sweet edge, while parents praised its thrift and shelf life. In emergencies, it was a lifesaver. Storms, strikes, or just a forgotten grocery run meant breakfast wasn't ruined. It even carried a certain patriotic air, promoted in government programs and touted as a sensible household staple. Today, powdered milk still exists, mostly for camping trips or food storage kits, but its heyday as an everyday stand-in has long passed, and yet it remains a symbol of resilience, a reminder of when families made do with what they had, and somehow managed to keep the cereal bowls full. S and H green stamps with groceries. Long before grocery store loyalty cards and app-based rewards programs, there were S and H green stamps, the little sticky currency of the 1960s household. Every trip to the supermarket, gas station, or department store meant a handful of these small green rectangles printed with promise. Shoppers tucked them into purses like treasure. Kids licked and stuck them into booklets. And slowly but surely, a catalog dream took shape. A toaster, a set of dishes, maybe even a shiny new vacuum cleaner. All could be purchased if you collected enough stamps. For many families, the ritual of filling those booklets was almost as satisfying as the reward itself. Children helped paste the stamps neatly, dreaming about what their trading bounty might become, while parents calculated how many grocery trips stood between them and that coveted blender. It was a quiet lesson in patience and the value of small things adding up. Today's loyalty points and cashback apps might feel slicker, but they lack the tactile joy of flipping through a green stamp catalog at the kitchen table. The whole system gave grocery shopping a sense of anticipation, proof that even buying bread and milk could come with the thrill of a prize. Butcher counters with paper-wrapped meat. Step into a 1960s grocery store, and one of the first sights to greet you would be the butcher counter, glowing under fluorescent lights, with rows of fresh cuts displayed like jewels on crushed ice. This wasn't the shrink-wrapped, styrofoam world we know today. This was meat chosen with a nod from the butcher, then wrapped carefully in thick white paper, secured with a neat fold and a strip of tape. For many families, that simple exchange carried weight. The butcher knew your name, your preferences, and sometimes even slipped in an extra bone for the soup. The ritual had a rhythm. Moms would stand in line, kids pressed up against the glass, watching sausages and steaks arranged with precision. When it was your turn, you didn't just point, you discussed dinner plans, coupons, budgets, and how far you needed that pound of ground beef to stretch. Back home, unwrapping that parcel was oddly ceremonial, the scent of fresh meat mingling with the paper itself. Today's pre-packaged selections offer convenience, but they've lost that human touch. The butcher counter was more than a place to shop. It was a relationship, a handshake of trust, and a reminder that dinner began not in plastic, but in paper and care. Penny candy at the checkout. For a child in the 1960s, no trip to the store was complete without the sweet promise of penny candy waiting by the checkout. Glass jars and wooden bins held a kaleidoscope of treats: licorice whips, root beer barrels, jawbreakers, candy buttons on paper strips, and those wax bottles filled with syrupy mystery liquid. A single coin, pressed sweaty and warm in a child's palm, could buy a tiny treasure trove of sugar. Parents tolerated the ritual, sometimes using it as a bribe for good behavior during the shopping trip, while kids lingered over the choices as if selecting jewels from a treasure chest. The candy itself wasn't just about taste, it was about independence. That moment of handing over a penny, making a choice, and savoring the spoils gave kids a sense of agency in a world mostly run by adults. And the candy, wrapped in bright paper or sold loose from bins, carried flavors that stuck in memory longer than on the tongue. Today, with inflation turning penny candy into a quaint phrase, the idea seems almost magical. The checkout counter has traded its glass jars for gum racks and energy shots, but in the 1960s, a penny really did buy a piece of happiness. Weekly paper coupons, clipped by mom. In the 1960s, Sunday mornings often meant more than church and a big breakfast. It meant spreading the newspaper across the kitchen table, scissors in hand, as mom clipped coupons with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Pages of grocery ads and little dotted squares promised 10 cents off flour, 5 cents off canned soup, maybe even a quarter off laundry detergent if you were lucky. Every clipping felt like a small victory, proof that a sharp eye and steady hand could stretch the family budget a little further. Kids sometimes joined in, cutting along crooked lines while learning that saving money was as much a ritual as saying grace before dinner. Those coupons, tucked neatly into envelopes or recipe boxes, traveled with mom to the grocery store, where she'd proudly hand them over at the register. The act wasn't just about thrift. It was about resourcefulness, about taking pride in finding ways to make a dollar do the work of two. Compared to today's digital coupon apps and loyalty card scans, the old paper clippings had a certain charm. They were tangible, hopeful little tickets to possibility, turning an ordinary shopping trip into a game of strategy and satisfaction. Milk deliveries in glass bottles. Before the era of grocery megastores and plastic gallon jugs, many 1960s households relied on the gentle clink of glass bottles on the doorstep to start their mornings. The milkman was a familiar figure, driving his truck through neighborhoods at dawn, swapping out empty bottles for fresh ones filled with creamy whole milk capped in cardboard discs. Children often woke to the soft rattle of bottles against metal carriers, a sound as much a part of daily life as the whir of the percolator in the kitchen. For busy parents, it was convenience. Before convenience was a buzzword, no last-minute milk runs, no fretting over spoiled cartons. The bottles themselves were sturdy and reusable, rinsed and returned each week, making the whole system quietly sustainable long before eco-friendly was fashionable. For kids, peeling back the cardboard cap to scoop the cream that floated on top felt like a secret treat. Today, the image of a milkman feels almost mythical, a relic from simpler times when food arrived fresh to your doorstep with a smile. But for families of the 1960s, those glass bottles weren't nostalgia. They were just life, dependable and wholesome, waiting faithfully outside the front door. Sunday pot roasts that cooked all day. In the 1960s, Sunday wasn't just a day of rest. It was a day of aromas that lingered from morning until evening, thanks to the pot roast slowly working its magic in the oven. The ritual was nearly universal, a hefty cut of beef nestled among carrots, onions, and potatoes, braising for hours until the meat surrendered into tenderness and the vegetables absorbed every savory drop. The house filled with a warmth that no air freshener could ever bottle, a signal that the week's hardest work was done and the family could gather around one table without rushing. For many, the Sunday roast was less about the recipe and more about the rhythm. Church in the morning, roast in the oven all afternoon, dinner at 5, leftovers for sandwiches the next day. It was a tradition that spoke of abundance. Even if the cut of beef was tough and bought on sale, patience transformed it into a feast. Kids might complain about waiting, noses pressed to the oven glass, but that anticipation only deepened the memory. Compared to today's DoorDash dinners and meal prep hacks, the all-day pot roast feels almost radical, a slow, steady reminder that some of the best meals are the ones that take their time. Company dinners with good china. When company was coming over in the 1960s, the entire household shifted into high gear. The living room was vacuumed within an inch of its life. Kids were scrubbed and warned to use their best manners. And most importantly, the good china came out from its hutch or sideboard. These plates, often wedding gifts or heirlooms, weren't for everyday meatloaf and mashed potatoes. They were for roast beef, molded salads, and pies meant to impress. The clink of porcelain and the shine of polished silverware elevated an ordinary meal into an event, a small theater of hospitality where the family showed its best face. For children, the rules were clear. Don't touch the china, don't chip the glasses, and for heaven's sake, don't spill the gravy boat. Parents, meanwhile, felt a mixture of pride and nerves, hoping the meal and the table setting lived up to the occasion. In a time before Instagram and Pinterest boards, this was the original tablescape, complete with lace tablecloths and folded napkins. Today, the notion of company dinners feels rare, replaced by casual takeout nights and paper plates. But back then, good china wasn't just dishware. It was a symbol of respect, tradition, and the art of making guests feel honored. Children setting the table every night. In the 1960s, dinner wasn't simply plopping food on the counter and grabbing a fork. It was a nightly ritual, and children were part of the choreography. Setting the table was one of the first real chores handed down to kids, a small but meaningful responsibility. Forks went on the left, knives and spoons on the right, napkins folded neatly, and glasses filled with water or milk waiting in a tidy line. There was a sense of order to it, a quiet rehearsal for the meal that reminded everyone that dinner was an event, not just a refueling stop. For parents, it was practical. Extra hands meant dinner hit the table faster. For kids, it was a lesson in manners and patience, even if they grumbled while counting out enough plates for everyone. The sight of a properly set table with steaming dishes in the center created an atmosphere of family unity, no matter how chaotic the day had been. Today, with so many meals eaten on couches or in cars, the ritual feels almost ceremonial. Back then, though, it was simply life, a reminder that everyone, even the youngest, had a role in turning an ordinary evening into a shared moment of togetherness. Dessert as a daily expectation. Jell-O, pudding, cake mix. In the 1960s, dessert dessert wasn't a once-in-a-while indulgence. It was the curtain call to nearly every dinner. Families expected something sweet to round off the meal, even if it was as simple as a bowl of Jell-O wobbling in a bright glass dish. Chocolate pudding, whipped up from a boxed mix and topped with a dollop of Cool Whip, felt downright luxurious to a child who had spent the day with lunchbox sandwiches and milk cartons. And then there was cake. Betty Crocker and Duncan Hines mixes turned any night into a mini celebration, with frosting from a can sealing the deal. For parents, these desserts were cheap, quick, and a way to make the ordinary feel special. For kids, they were motivation to clean plates, vegetables included, just to earn that promised treat. Dessert carried a cultural weight too. It reflected abundance, comfort, and the simple joy of ending the day on a sweet note. Today, dessert has been relegated to special occasions or Instagram-worthy creations, but in the 1960s, it was simply expected. Back then, even a humble square of yellow cake or a chilled pudding cup was enough to remind everyone at the table that life, at least for a moment, was sweet. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze. Few dishes define the 1960s dinner table more than the humble meatloaf crowned with its shiny red ketchup glaze. It was a masterpiece of thrift and creativity, taking ground beef, often stretched with breadcrumbs, oats, or even crushed crackers, and turning it into a hearty family meal. The ritual of shaping the loaf by hand, patting it into a pan, and then slathering on a generous coat of ketchup felt almost ceremonial. As it baked, the glaze caramelized into a tangy sweet crust that kids either loved or politely scraped off when mom wasn't looking. For parents, meatloaf was dependable and forgiving. It could feed a crowd and produce leftovers that reappeared in sandwiches the next day, tucked between slices of Wonder Bread with an extra smear of ketchup. It was also a dish that didn't demand fancy ingredients, just pantry staples and a bit of patience. Today, meatloaf sometimes gets side-eyed as retro comfort food, replaced by gourmet burgers and artisanal meatballs. But there's a resilience to it, a reminder of a time when families gathered around the table, plates piled high, and a glossy red loaf promised warmth, frugality, and the dependable taste of home. Church potluck suppers. In the 1960s America, few gatherings embodied community spirit more than the church potluck supper. These events turned the fellowship hall into a buffet of homegrown generosity, with long tables groaning under Pyrex casseroles, crock pots of baked beans, deviled eggs arranged just so, and of course, a few towering Jell-O salads, gleaming like stained glass. Every family brought a dish, usually one perfected over years, and whispered about as Sister Johnson's famous fried chicken, or Mrs. Miller's unbeatable peach cobbler. For kids, the potluck was a wonderland, permission to sample everyone else's cooking, piling plates high with dishes their mothers never made at home. For parents, it was both duty and delight, a chance to share what they had, no matter how modest, and to sit shoulder to shoulder with neighbors in a spirit of fellowship. The potluck was as much about conversation as it was about food, catching up on news, swapping recipes, and building bonds that extended beyond Sunday service. Today, catered events and restaurant meetups often take the place of these communal spreads. But in the 1960s, the potluck supper was a reminder that food, faith, and friendship could all fit on one long table. Crocks of homemade pickles. In the 1960s, before supermarket aisles overflowed with a dozen brands of dill spears and bread and butter slices, many families turned to the tried and true method of making their own pickles in big ceramic crocks. Tucked away in cool basements or lined up on pantry shelves, these crocks brimmed with cucumbers, garlic, dill, and brine, quietly transforming over days or weeks into crisp, tangy treasures. The air often carried that sharp, vinegary perfume, and kids sneaking down to the cellar would lift the lid just to peek and maybe snag one early, even if it wasn't quite ready. Pickling wasn't just about flavor, it was about resourcefulness. Cucumbers from backyard gardens or Victory Garden remnants found new life in those crocks, stretching summer's bounty deep into winter. For many families, the sight of a crock on the counter meant tradition, thrift, and a guarantee that the table would never lack for something crunchy and sharp to cut through a heavy meal. Today, artisanal pickles line farmers market stalls at premium prices, but the spirit is the same. Back then, it wasn't hipster. It was just practical, a salty reminder that sometimes the simplest preservation brought the biggest satisfaction. Holiday fruitcakes, mailed to relatives. Few holiday traditions in the 1960s America were as enduring or as divisive as the ritual of mailing fruitcakes to friends and relatives. Dense, heavy, and packed with candied cherries, neon green pineapple, and enough nuts to make it double as a paperweight. These cakes traveled by post like edible bricks of seasonal cheer. Families baked them weeks in advance, often soaking them in brandy or rum so they'd survive the journey and taste better upon arrival. The arrival of a fruitcake box at the doorstep was both a gesture of love and, sometimes, a cause for gentle groaning. For many households, fruitcake wasn't a joke, it was tradition. Recipes were guarded, passed down, and baked in large batches to ensure everyone on the mailing list got one. Kids often eyed them suspiciously, preferring sugar cookies or fudge, while adults sliced them thin, sometimes more out of politeness than craving. Yet the act of sending one was deeply sincere, a way of bridging distance with something homemade, or at least home-mailed. Today, fruitcake jokes abound, but in the 1960s, it was less punchline and more proof of connection. Heavy, yes, but so was the love that inspired it to travel cross-country, wrapped and ribboned in holiday goodwill. Eating without TV, just conversation or arguing. In the 1960s, dinner wasn't accompanied by the hum of a television set or the glow of a dozen phone screens. It was centered on the table, where the main entertainment came from conversation. Families sat down together, forks clinking against plates, and the evening unfolded in words, stories, and, often enough, a little arguing. Parents asked about school, kids swapped tales about recess adventures, and teenagers rolled their eyes while trying not to reveal too much. It wasn't always idyllic. Siblings squabbled, dad might bring up chores left undone, and mom kept an eagle eye on vegetables being accidentally pushed aside. But it was real, yet, and shared. This daily ritual wasn't just about eating, it was about connection. The table acted as a stage for lessons in manners, patience, and even negotiation. No dessert until you finish those peas. For children, it was sometimes tedious, sometimes comforting, but always grounding. Compared to today, when meals are often solitary or rushed, the 1960s dinner table feels almost radical in its insistence on togetherness. Conversation wasn't a side dish, it was part of the meal, nourishing in its own way. A reminder that family wasn't just who you ate with, but how you spoke, listened, and sometimes disagreed. Drinking Tang, because astronauts did. In the 1960s, nothing captured the imagination of American kids quite like the space race, and nothing captured their taste buds quite like Tang, the powdered orange drink that became famous for hitching a ride with NASA. Developed in the late 50s, Tang was marketed as the futuristic beverage of choice for astronauts, which instantly made it cooler than milk, juice, or anything else sitting in the fridge. Moms Moms loved it because it was cheap, shelf-stable, and quick to mix. Just add water, stir, and voila. Space-age refreshment in a glass. Kids loved it because, well, if it was good enough for John Glenn, it was good enough for them. The flavor was aggressively sweet, vaguely citrus, and not quite like any real orange on earth. But that didn't matter. Drinking Tang wasn't about taste. It was about belonging to the grand adventure of the 1960s, when going to the moon felt just around the corner. Breakfast tables became launch pads, with kids slurping neon orange liquid as though it might give them astronaut strength. Today, Tang survives mostly as a nostalgic novelty, overshadowed by sports drinks and smoothies. But in its heyday, it was a symbol of wonder, proof you could taste the future, one sugary sip at a time. Peanut butter and fluff sandwiches. In the 1960s, few lunchbox staples were as beloved or as sticky as the peanut butter and fluff sandwich. Made with thick spreads of peanut butter and marshmallow creme, the legendary marshmallow fluff from New England. It was a sweet, gooey alternative to the more sensible peanut butter and jelly. Kids adored it, not just for the taste, but for the sheer fun of pulling the sandwich apart and watching the marshmallow stretch into long, sugary strings. Parents, meanwhile, tolerated the mess because it was cheap, quick, and guaranteed to be eaten without complaint. The peanut butter and fluff combo was pure childhood indulgence, the kind of sandwich that felt like a small rebellion against vegetables and seriousness. It didn't pretend to be healthy, and that was part of its charm. For many, it was also tied to moments of comfort, an after-school snack, a Saturday lunch before heading out to ride bikes, or a sleepover treat shared with friends. Today, it has an almost cult nostalgia, with some adults sneaking back to it when they crave something uncomplicated and joyfully over the top. In the 1960s, though, it wasn't retro. It was just life, sticky fingers and all. Wax paper sandwich wrappers, pre-Ziploc. Before the age of plastic baggies with zippers that snap shut, sandwiches in the 1960s were swaddled in wax paper. Moms would tear off a sheet, fold it neatly around a bologna and cheese or peanut butter and jelly, and tuck the tidy little package into a brown paper bag or metal lunchbox. The wax paper kept the bread from drying out, mostly, and carried a faint crinkle that every school kid recognized the moment they pulled it out at the cafeteria table. Sometimes, the folds came undone by lunchtime, leaving the sandwich half-dressed and sliding around, but no one thought twice about it. Wax paper was simple, cheap, and endlessly reusable around the kitchen, covering leftovers or lining cookie tins. For children, it added a kind of anticipation. Unwrapping the sandwich felt like opening a gift, even if the contents were predictable. Compared to today's airtight plastic, the method was far from perfect, but it carried a certain charm. There was no chasing lost lids or fumbling with stubborn zippers, just a sheet of paper and a little know-how. Looking back, wax paper sandwiches weren't just practical. They were part of a rhythm of daily life, one crinkle at a time. Milk cartons with peel-back corners. In the 1960s, every school cafeteria had its own symphony of sounds, and one of the most distinct was the rustle and snap of milk cartons being opened. These weren't the convenient screw-top cartons we know today. They were squat, square containers with sealed paperboard corners that had to be pinched, pulled, and pried open with varying degrees of success. Kids quickly learned there were two kinds of milk drinkers: those who mastered the neat triangle pour on the first try, and those who mangled the corner until the carton collapsed like a sad little accordion. The milk inside was usually lukewarm by modern standards, whether whole or chocolate, but it was part of the lunch ritual: sandwich, cookie, and that stubborn carton. Teachers and cafeteria workers sometimes sometimes came to the rescue, expertly flicking the corners open with a practiced hand. For children, though, victory was sweet. Successfully opening the carton meant not just a drink, but a tiny triumph of independence. Today's packaging is cleaner, easier, and less prone to accidents, but those peel-back cartons remain etched in memory. They were messy, yes, but also a rite of passage, proof that even milk could test your patience before rewarding your thirst. Metal lunchboxes with cartoon heroes. In the 1960s, carrying a metal lunchbox wasn't just about holding your sandwich and apple. It was a full-blown declaration of identity. These sturdy little cases, complete with a matching thermos that always seemed to leak a bit, were decorated with the heroes and icons of the day. The Flintstones, Superman, the Jetsons, and even cowboy stars beamed from colorful panels, turning an ordinary lunch into a daily fashion statement. Kids didn't just eat from them. They compared, traded, and bragged about which characters marched proudly across their box. The clatter of those lunchboxes in a school hallway was unmistakable, a chorus of tin against tile that marked the noon bell. Inside, the contents were simple: sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, maybe a cookie, maybe a piece of fruit, but the box itself made it special. Over time, the paint chipped and the handles cracked, yet they carried a patina of use that no plastic bag could ever match. Today, those same boxes are sought after collectibles, fetching high prices from nostalgic adults who once banged them against cafeteria tables. Back then, though, they were more than containers. They were badges of childhood, little armored cases that carried not just food, but pride. Bologna sandwiches on Wonder Bread. Few lunches in the 1960s America were as ubiquitous or as simple as the bologna sandwich on Wonder Bread, with its perfectly round pink slices stacked between pillowy white bread, often accompanied by a swipe of mustard or a dab of Miracle Whip. It was the working definition of no-fuss nourishment. Packed into metal lunchboxes or brown paper bags, these sandwiches carried kids through school days and dads through lunch breaks, sturdy and predictable as clockwork. For many children, the taste of bologna, salty, spongy, faintly mysterious, became inseparable from the memory of cafeteria chatter and playground recess. Wonder Bread itself was part of the magic. Marketed as building strong bodies 12 ways, its soft texture and uniform slices made it the perfect canvas for lunch meat. Pairing it with bologna wasn't fancy, but it was affordable, filling, and endlessly repeatable. Parents appreciated how quickly the sandwiches came together, while kids simply accepted them as the default fuel of childhood. Today, artisan breads and nitrate-free deli meats have taken over, and the humble bologna sandwich is often dismissed as lowbrow. Yet for those who grew up in the 1960s, it remains iconic, a modest meal that carried with it the comfort of routine and the taste of simpler times. Butter Pats, wrapped in foil at cafeterias. In the 1960s, the school or hospital cafeteria tray often came with a tiny treasure, a neat little butter pat wrapped in foil. These miniature squares gleamed like gold, sometimes stamped with a cheerful logo, or simply folded into a tidy block, waiting to be unwrapped with careful fingers. For children, they added a touch of ceremony to an otherwise ordinary meal. Peeling back the foil was like unwrapping candy, only to reveal the cool pale square of butter inside. Spread across a dinner roll or melted onto steamed vegetables, it gave even the most modest cafeteria lunch a hint of richness. The foil pats weren't just practical, they carried a kind of charm. They were portion control before portion control was a buzzword, ensuring that each diner received just enough without waste. Sometimes they'd end up pocketed by mischievous kids who saw them as tokens rather than condiments. Today, little plastic tubs and squeeze packets have replaced the foil-wrapped pat, stripping away that moment of unwrapping. It's a small change, but one that speaks volumes about the shift from elegance to efficiency. Back then, butter in foil was more than dairy. It was a tiny luxury wrapped in shiny promise. Chocolate pudding cups, homemade, not snack packs. In the 1960s, before plastic cups of shelf-stable pudding filled supermarket aisles, chocolate pudding was a homemade affair, simmered slowly on the stovetop. Mothers stirred the mixture with patience, watching as milk, sugar, cocoa, and cornstarch thickened into something rich and velvety. Once cooled, it was ladled into little glass custard cups or Pyrex dishes, each portion often topped with a dollop of whipped cream or, for the especially lucky, a sprinkling of shaved chocolate. The refrigerator door would reveal these treasures chilling on a shelf, promising a dessert far more comforting than anything sealed under foil lids. For children, the wait was agony, noses pressed against the fridge, but the payoff was worth it. Smooth, chocolatey, and infinitely better than store-bought. Parents, meanwhile, loved pudding for its thriftiness. It used staples most households always had on hand. It was the kind of dessert that felt both humble and indulgent, a balance perfectly in step with the decade. Today's ready-made cups offer convenience, but they lack the ritual, the stirring, the cooling, the anticipation that makes pudding special. Back then, chocolate pudding wasn't just a sweet treat. It was proof that with a little time and effort, comfort could be created from the simplest ingredients. Red Jell-O cubes on lunch trays. For any child in the 1960s, the sight of those bright red Jell-O cubes wobbling on a beige plastic lunch tray was both familiar and oddly reassuring. Cut into neat squares, they sat in their compartment like little jewels, catching the cafeteria lights and daring kids to poke them with a fork just to watch them jiggle. The flavor was vaguely cherry, vaguely strawberry, and entirely artificial, but none of that mattered. Jell-O was sweet, cold, and easy to eat, which made it a cafeteria favorite and a rare item no one tried to trade away. The cubes were also a kind of comic relief amid the mystery meat and overcooked vegetables that rounded out a typical school lunch. They slid across the tray if you tilted it, sometimes tumbling into mashed potatoes or green beans, creating a Frankenstein's monster of flavors that horrified teachers and delighted mischievous kids. Today, school desserts are more likely to be packaged cookies or yogurt cups, but those trembling red cubes remain a nostalgic symbol of simpler times. They weren't just dessert, they were entertainment, a sweet splash of color in a sea of beige institutional food, proof that even lunch could wobble with a little joy. Peanut butter cookies from scratch. In the 1960s, peanut butter cookies weren't something you bought in a plastic sleeve at the store. They were baked right at home, often on a Saturday afternoon when the whole kitchen filled with the warm, nutty aroma. Mothers, and sometimes kids eager to help, mixed pantry staples, flour, sugar, eggs, and of course a generous scoop of peanut butter, then rolled the dough into little balls before pressing each one with the tines of a fork to make that iconic crisscross pattern. The cookies baked until golden, their edges just crisp while the centers stayed soft, the kind that melted on your tongue and left crumbs sprinkled across the formica table. For children, waiting for the tray to cool was the hardest part, noses hovering just above the counter, fingers itching to snatch one too soon. For parents, it was a simple, affordable indulgence that turned ordinary ingredients into something memorable. A tin of peanut butter cookies often made its way to church socials, school bake sales, or as a lunchbox surprise, bringing a little sweetness to the everyday. Today, they live on as nostalgia nostalgic comfort food. But in the 1960s, they weren't retro. They were just life. Homemade, humble, and irresistibly good. Drink your milk. Posters in classrooms. In the 1960s, it was nearly impossible to walk into a classroom or cafeteria without being greeted by a cheerful poster reminding kids to drink your milk. Brightly colored images showed smiling children with tall glasses of milk, often flanked by cartoon cows or promises of strong bones and healthy teeth. This was no accident. It was part of a nationwide campaign fueled by the dairy industry and echoed by schools, which treated milk not just as a beverage, but as an essential building block of childhood. Teachers reinforced the message daily, urging students to finish the little cartons handed out at lunch. For many kids, it became a ritual, cracking open the stubborn cardboard corner, gulping down lukewarm milk, and hearing that ever-present echo of health advice. Parents echoed it at home too, creating a chorus of milk advocacy that made soda seem almost rebellious. Looking back, it's easy to chuckle at the single-minded push, especially in an era before almond, oat, and soy alternatives lined grocery shelves. But at the time, milk was more than a drink. It was practically a patriotic duty, a white mustache of proof that you were growing up strong, one carton at a time. Block parties with homemade potato salad. In 1960s America, summertime often meant block parties. Those sprawling neighborhood gatherings where kids rode bikes in the street, dads manned charcoal grills, and moms arrived carrying bowls of homemade potato salad. It was the unofficial dish of community, scooped generously from pastel Pyrex or big enamel bowls, each recipe slightly different but all familiar. Some versions leaned heavy on mayonnaise, others on mustard, with a sprinkle of paprika across the top for flair. Chopped pickles, onions, or hard-boiled eggs might make an appearance, sparking quiet debates over which neighbor made it best. The potato salad wasn't just food, it was a handshaken dish form, proof that everyone was contributing to the feast. Kids darted between tables, balancing paper plates piled with hot dogs, corn on the cob, and, of course, a heaping spoonful of the creamy salad. Adults lingered over it while catching up on gossip, discussing Little League games, or talking about the latest news. Today, neighborhoods are often more scattered, and gatherings lean toward catered trays or store-bought sides. But in the 1960s, potato salad at a block party was a badge of community pride, humble, hearty, and as much a part of summer as fireflies and sparklers. Lemonade stands on every corner. In the 1960s, summertime sidewalks weren't complete without the sight of kids hunched over a card table, a hand-painted sign flapping in the breeze, and a pitcher of lemonade sweating in the sun. Lemonade stands were everywhere, on suburban corners, at the end of long driveways, or perched near the neighborhood park, symbols of childhood enterprise and pure Americana. For a nickel or a dime, neighbors could buy a paper cup of tart, sweet refreshment, often poured with sticky fingers and a wide grin. For the kids running them, lemonade stands were more than play. They were lessons in responsibility and a first taste of independence. The thrill of counting coins, making change, and proudly reporting profits to parents was as satisfying as the lemonade itself. Sometimes the recipe was from real lemons, sometimes just a can of powdered mix, but no one minded. It wasn't about the flavor, it was about the ritual, the neighborly exchange, the idea that anyone could set up shop and be part of the community. Today, the lemonade stand feels quaint, a novelty staged for nostalgia. But in the 1960s, it was real and everywhere, proof that summer freedom and a little ambition could fit in a Dixie cup. Ice cream trucks with real bells, not jingles. In the 1960s, the sound that sent kids sprinting down the street on summer afternoons wasn't the electronic jingle we hear today. It was the clear, bright ringing of real brass bells. The ice cream man would swing them by hand or let them clang from the side of his truck, the sound carrying across yards and alleys like a sweet siren song. Children froze mid-game, heads snapping up before scattering toward home to beg parents for spare change. A few coins were all it took to transform a hot day into a moment of magic, with choices ranging from rocket-shaped popsicles to fudgy bars that dripped onto the sidewalk before you could finish them. The trucks themselves were simple, white-painted vans with colorful decals, not the loud neon-lit wagons of today. The bell was enough, its cheerful clatter promising cold relief and a little joy. Parents tolerated the chaos, knowing that for a dime or quarter, they bought their kids more than a treat. They bought a memory. Today's digitized jingles can feel tinny and intrusive, but back then, the sound of real bells was pure excitement. It was the soundtrack of summer, a simple ring that meant happiness was only a few steps and a few coins away. Homemade popsicles in Tupperware molds. In the 1960s, when summer heat pressed down and store-bought treats weren't always in the budget, families turned to homemade popsicles made in trusty Tupperware molds. Brightly colored plastic trays with snap-on handles filled the freezer, holding mixtures of Kool-Aid, fruit juice, or even leftover chocolate milk. Kids checked the freezer door every half hour, impatient for the magic to set, and when at last the pops were ready, they tugged them free with sticky hands, triumph gleaming brighter than the popsicle itself. These homemade treats carried a double thrill, not just the sweet, icy taste, but the sense of creation. Children felt proud helping pour the juice, snapping on the lids, and claiming ownership of the finished product. Moms loved the practicality, cheap ingredients, reusable molds, and a way to stretch a pitcher of lemonade into a week's worth of snacks. Unlike store-bought bars wrapped in crinkly paper, these were humble, homegrown, and deeply personal. Today, you can buy endless gourmet flavors at the grocery store, but the charm of the homemade popsicle lingers. In the 1960s, it wasn't just dessert, it was summertime in your hand, frozen joy on a stick that tasted like freedom and family. Ladies' church cookbooks filled with secret recipes. In the 1960s, nearly every church group, ladies' auxiliary, or neighborhood club seemed to have its own community cookbook. These were not glossy, mass-produced tomes, but humble, spiral-bound collections typed on mimeographed pages, often dotted with smudges and butter stains from eager use. Each recipe carried not just instructions, but a name: Mrs. Peterson's chocolate sheet cake, or Aunt Millie's potato salad, cementing the dishes as both personal and communal treasures. To outsiders, they might have looked like simple potluck fare, but to those in the know, they were secret recipes, guarded by tradition and shared only through these carefully compiled volumes. For women of the era, these cookbooks were more than culinary guides. They were social glue. They connected households, preserved family legacies, and created a sense of belonging that stretched from the church basement to the Sunday dinner table. Kids grew up recognizing dishes not by name, but by who baked them, associating flavors with faces in the congregation. Today, those spiral-bound cookbooks are nostalgic artifacts, often tucked into drawers or discovered at thrift shops. But in their time, they were precious, living proof that food was never just sustenance. It was identity, friendship, and a recipe card passed lovingly down the pews. Popcorn made on the stovetop. Before microwaves and bags of butter-flavored kernels became the norm, popcorn in the 1960s 1960s was an event made right on the stovetop. A heavy pan, a splash of oil, and a handful of kernels were all it took. Soon came the telltale rattle, then the sharp, joyful pops that grew faster and louder until the lid lifted with the pressure of fluffy corn bursting inside. Kids gathered close, listening like it was fireworks in a pot, waiting for that last pop before mom or dad whisked it off the burner. The result wasn't perfectly uniform like today's microwave variety. It was a mix of big fluffy pieces, half-popped kernels, and a few scorched ones that someone inevitably ate anyway. A sprinkle of salt, maybe a drizzle of melted butter, and the bowl was passed around while the family settled in for the Ed Sullivan Show or a neighborhood movie night. It was cheap, simple, and communal, turning a handful of kernels into a treat that filled the whole room with warmth. Today's pre-packaged bags are convenient, but they lack the theater of stovetop popping, a small ritual of sound, smell, and anticipation that made even an ordinary evening feel special. Root beer floats at soda fountains. In the 1960s, a trip to the local soda fountain wasn't just about quenching thirst. It was a small adventure, and few treats were as iconic as the root beer float. Served in tall, frosty glasses, the combination was simple but magical. Fizzy root beer poured over a generous scoop of vanilla ice cream, sending foamy bubbles spilling over the rim. The first sip was always a sweet clash of cold cream and sharp carbonation, a flavor so distinct it instantly carved itself into memory. Soda fountains were gathering spots, humming with chatter and jukebox tunes, and the float was their crown jewel. Teenagers on dates shared them with 2 straws. Kids begged for one as a reward after errands, and adults indulged in the nostalgia of something both playful and refreshing. The float wasn't just dessert, it was a ritual, a pause in the day wrapped in laughter, chrome stools, and clinking glasses. Today, you can still whip one up at home, but the experience isn't quite the same without the counter, the soda jerk in a paper hat, and the buzz of a community hub. In the 1960s, a root beer float was more than a drink. It was pure Americana in a glass. Kool-Aid pitchers on hot days. On sweltering summer afternoons in the 1960s, nothing signaled relief quite like a sweating glass pitcher of Kool-Aid sitting in the center of the kitchen table. The process was simple, almost ceremonial. Tear open the brightly colored packet, dump the neon powder into the pitcher, add sugar, lots of sugar, and stir until the water transformed into a liquid jewel of cherry red, grape purple, or electric orange. Kids hovered nearby, glasses clinking with ice cubes, waiting for that first sweet, tangy sip that painted tongues in unnatural shades. Kool-Aid wasn't just a drink, it was childhood in a glass. It fueled backyard adventures, lemonade stand alternatives, and sticky-lipped laughter that carried late into the evening. Moms loved it for its thrift, just pennies per serving, while kids loved it for the way it turned ordinary water into something almost magical. The Kool-Aid man hadn't yet begun bursting through walls in commercials, but the sense of fun was already baked in. Today, bottled sports drinks and juice boxes dominate, but the memory of stirring sugar clouds into a pitcher remains powerful. In the 1960s, Kool-Aid wasn't a brand gimmick. It was summertime itself, poured into every glass with a smile. Candy cigarettes. Because why? In the 1960s, tucked alongside Jawbreakers and licorice at the corner store, sat one of the most puzzling treats of all, candy cigarettes. Packaged in little cardboard boxes made to look eerily eerily like real cigarette packs. These chalky white sticks of sugar, or sometimes bubble gum wrapped in paper, let kids imitate the very habit their parents were trying and failing to quit. Children strutted around playgrounds with one hanging from their lips, puffing imaginary smoke, snapping the candy in half with exaggerated flair, and thinking they looked impossibly grown up. Looking back, it's almost absurd. Why normalize smoking by turning it into candy? But in an era when cigarette ads still filled TV screens and Hollywood stars lit up in nearly every scene, it felt oddly natural. Parents rarely batted an eye, often laughing at the sight, and kids were thrilled to mimic adult behavior without the consequences. The candy itself wasn't particularly delicious, sweet, brittle, and gone in a bite, but it wasn't about the flavor. It was about the performance. Today, the very idea feels shocking, and candy cigarettes have largely disappeared or been rebranded as candy sticks. But in the 1960s, they were a strange, sugary rite of passage, proof that even playtime carried a whiff of imitation adulthood. 5-cent glass bottles of Coca-Cola. In the 1960s, few pleasures were as simple and satisfying as popping the cap off an ice-cold glass bottle of Coca-Cola, and all for just 5 cents. Whether plucked from a red vending machine that clunked and whirred or fished out of a gas station cooler packed with ice, that little green glass bottle felt like treasure in your hand. The first fizzy sip burned just enough to make your eyes water, and somehow it always tasted better from glass than from any can or plastic that would come later. For kids, saving up a nickel meant access to a world of refreshment and independence. For adults, it was a small luxury that fit easily into the weekly budget. The bottles themselves carried their own charm, sturdy, recyclable, and often returned in wooden crates stacked neatly at the corner store. Sometimes you'd even find regional slogans etched on the bottom, sparking friendly arguments over whose bottle came from farther away. Today, Coca-Cola is everywhere, but it rarely feels special. Back then, that 5-cent bottle wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual, a reward, and proof that the best things in life could, quite literally, be had for a nickel. Hand crank can openers. In the 1960s, before kitchens buzzed with electric gadgets, the hand crank can opener was a humble but indispensable tool. Usually tucked in a drawer or hanging on a hook, it was a simple device of metal gears and a turning handle, ready to tackle the endless parade of canned goods that defined mid-century meals. From Campbell's soup to Spam, fruit cocktail to green beans, nearly every dinner began with the satisfying punch of the blade-piercing tin, followed by the steady grind of the crank as the lid curled away. For kids, mastering the can opener was a small rite of passage, proof you were old enough to help in the kitchen, though it sometimes ended with a jagged lid and a stern warning about sharp edges. For parents, it was just part of the rhythm of cooking, as reliable as the salt shaker or wooden spoon. Compared to today's sleek electric versions, the hand crank model demanded a little effort, but it also gave a sense of control, of connection to the very act of preparing food. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sturdy, dependable, and always there, an unassuming hero of the 1960s kitchen drawer. Meat grinders clamped to the counter. In the 1960s, before pre-packaged ground beef became the supermarket norm, many households relied on a trusty hand crank meat grinder that clamped firmly to the kitchen counter. Made of heavy metal with a shiny crank and a hopper on top, it looked more like farm equipment than a cooking tool. Families fed in chunks of beef, pork, or even leftover roasts, turning the handle until fresh ground meat spiraled out in neat ribbons. The process was a little messy, a little noisy, but it gave cooks control over quality and stretch, adding breadcrumbs or vegetables vegetables right into the grind to make every pound go further. For kids, watching the grinder in action was mesmerizing, if slightly unsettling, and many begged to take a turn at the crank. For parents, it was about practicality, thrift, freshness, and the satisfaction of doing it themselves. Recipes like meatloaf, sausages, and casseroles often began with that grinder, transforming scraps into something hearty and new. Today, meat grinders are niche gadgets for food enthusiasts, but in the 1960s, they were everyday workhorses. Clamped to the counter, they stood as symbols of resourcefulness, turning the kitchen into both a workshop and a place where nothing went to waste. Rotary dial kitchen wall phones. In the 1960s, the kitchen wasn't just the heart of the home for cooking, it was also command central for communication, thanks to the rotary dial wall phone, usually mounted in a bright color, avocado green, harvest gold, or classic beige. It hung on the wall with a long coiled cord that stretched halfway across the room. Mom stirred sauce with one hand while cradling the receiver on a shoulder. Kids tangled themselves in the cord during gossip-filled calls, and everyone knew the satisfying whir click of dialing each number. It wasn't fast, but it had a kind of rhythm that made calling someone feel deliberate, almost ceremonial. These phones weren't just for chatting, they were lifelines, tying households to neighbors, schools, and relatives. A phone call often carried weight, whether it was good news, bad news, or just grandma checking in. Privacy was scarce. With the phone in the kitchen, everyone could overhear, making teenage conversations both mortifying and brief. Compared to today's smartphones, rotary phones were clunky, slow, and firmly anchored to one spot. But they were also dependable, built to last, and somehow comforting in their permanence. The kitchen phone wasn't just a device, it was a fixture, part of the daily hum of family life. Growing up in the 1960s, America was full of little rituals, tastes, and sounds that shaped everyday life, many of them now tucked away in memory. From Jell-O molds to rotary phones, these forgotten things weren't just objects or meals. They were part of what made family, community, and childhood so unique in that era. Which of these do you remember most, or wish would make a comeback? Share your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more nostalgic journeys. After all, the past is always sweeter when we remember it together.